Hi everyone, this is Manu Machaba. Today we'll be discussing one of the most interesting and a little bit complex to understand by most people. We'll be talking about conflict management and resolution. Now, the question always be asked, or that I got asked, who are the people that are generally affected by conflict? We're talking here, those people would be your employers, your employees, your managers and team leaders, suppliers of goods and services, family members, our spouses, friends and colleagues, as well as our stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders. Let's understand, what do we mean by conflict? We'll try and conceptualize this conflict idea and also try and understand what do we mean by conflict. Basically, where does conflict occur, and as well as what do we understand by the general concept of conflict. Conflict is when there are two opposing views or opinions or values. It can even be perspectives, preferences, goals, ideas, and how we perceive our realities of the world, the so-called maps of reality. However, how then do we identify if there is a conflict? One, you'd find that you try and avoid certain people or certain situations where those people are present. You generally feel uncomfortable being around certain people that you've got issues with. You have discussions with people other than the person that you have conflicts with, especially behind their backs. You have a tendency of avoiding issues that need to be discussed, no matter how burning they are, and you think that you rather let it pass. You get irritated by certain people. It could be that they do something minor, of which if you didn't have a conflict with that person, you'd not have easily been irritated. But however, because of your history with that person, you get easily irritated. One of the basic reasons why we have a conflict is because we've got a natural emotional need to be right. And everybody wants to assert that, the fact that they are right and somebody else is wrong. Conflict has got its origins. It's got the results, and the results are followed by the effects, that is, the consequences thereof. And generally, you'll see that these effects are not good. It occurs in stages. It never happens at once. It progresses through various stages. There's about 5 stages, from the latency stage up to the outcome stage. That's where people really lose it. It can be emotional. There's, physical attacks. There could be, verbal outbursts and so on. And generally, we shouldn't avoid conflict, because conflict never disappears. It will always resurface at a certain stage, unless there are instances where, for an example, you'll never see this person again. It's a very minor issue for you to try and make a big fuss of it. And conflict has 2 emotional diversions. It's got what you call a conflict debt, and which I'll explain to you what it is, as well as conflict aversion. When you've got a conflict debt, that's when you've got concerns but you don't raise them. You eventually keep grudges, or you don't even assert your opinions, because remember, you want to avoid conflict. You don't assert your feelings. You always draw back in terms of your views, or we let unresolved issues pile up, and that unfortunately will result would initially be the origins of conflict aversion. That is where you generally avoid to disagree with certain people, because you don't want to be involved, or you don't want to be seen as a bad person. And where this comes from is from childhood. Generally, as kids, we have been told to be good to other kids. We have been told when there's an incident that happened that we are the source of those conflicts. So naturally, you want to try and avoid those instances. It also comes from the need to be nice to other people. Like we briefly addressed it. We always have that need of not stepping on, so-called stepping on people's toes. So we try our level best to be nice to these people. Often when you try and interject, or you want to get involved in and resolve issues, you have been told mind your own business, or don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong. So we tend to try and now avert those conflicts because we don't want to be told that is none of your business. And also that we have been blamed for causing other people's displeasure. And often we have been told that when somebody is not happy, that we are the source of those people's unhappiness. And we also try and avoid uncomfortable conversations. This is where you learn not to question people, especially those in power or in authority. It could be your manager, it could be your parents. It is not about answering back or talking back, but raising issues in a right way. And unfortunately, we end up not resolving these issues, and we develop a way of averting these conflicts. Now, conflict has got the personal as well as organizational aspects. Well, let's look at your organizational conflicts. These ones are the most difficult to resolve because they generally involve people from different backgrounds, cultures, ethnic groups, different ideologies, political and religious ideologies. And unfortunately, it's because we don't choose our friends. We don't choose, or rather we can choose our friends, but we cannot choose our work colleagues. So we find ourselves in that state where there's a whole plethora of diversities of people. And research has found that about 65% of the conflicts at work is not actually caused by, or rather, poor performance is not caused by lack of training or inability to perform, but generally it's based or is caused by conflicts that are unresolved, which lead to bad relationships. And also they've also found that when these conflicts are not resolved, they result in about 80% failure rate of most of the projects. And further, that managers unfortunately find themselves having to spend about 25% of their time dealing with conflicts between themselves and the team leaders, conflicts amongst the team members, conflicts between the peers, and so on. Now, some of this, we're going to look at what are the sources of this conflict. One of the biggest sources of conflict is interdependence. And this is where, especially in projects, where you need somebody's input or contribution before you can move on to the next stage. Diversity. You'll see that different personality types have got different ways of dealing with issues, even whether at home or at work. Gender differences, generational gaps. The way your generation X and your alpha generation, your X generation, your Z generation deal with issues are completely different. And we'll get into the details of diversity issues. Cultural differences. People from different cultures address issues differently. Nationality issues and ethnicity. Sometimes we as managers or employers contribute greatly in terms of how we don't share the resources and the workload. You know, there will be those people that we like that, you know, get supported highly with resources. Those that, you know, they are least preferred will be given a lot of workload, and you know, sometimes people have got scarce resources which are unevenly distributed. Poor communication, very often even sometimes there isn't any communication. You see things being done, and certain people are privy to certain information and others are not. You have inconsistencies. Very often when you've got people that you favor, they tend to get certain benefits. People feel that they're not being appreciated, or, you know, their efforts are not recognized or acknowledged. Management styles, managers have got different styles of management. Some are more situational, some are more bossy, some are more dictators. So, you know, different styles. And also how we respond to these different styles as, you know, employees. It also can contribute towards conflict. Whenever there are conflicts, people tend to attack each other instead of dealing with the conflict itself, dealing with the problem. So as a result, it creates organizational conflicts. Now, how then do we respond to workplace conflicts? Obviously, there's anger. And with anger, it's followed by, you know, formation of alliances, factionalism, and polarization. Also, we find that there are fights and clashes. Most of them, they end up very ugly and they result in workplace dismissals. Low morale. People are, you know, they don't have motivation. You know, they're disengaged. They're at work, but they're not working. And we find that also that there is, you know, organizations end up having costly arbitrations and litigations. And these could be also in a form of your mediation, arbitration, courts, and so on. And unfortunately, they result in expenses which have got nothing to do with your productions. And these usually we cannot even account for them. Resignation letters, you know, there's a very high attrition of resignations, especially by skilled employees, and usually they give you about less than 24-hour notice to say they are resigning, because of, if they say it in Afrikaans, you know, you know, fall met wat gebeur, and so as a result they don't want to work anymore. So those are some of the issues that, you know, will result in that. And let's look at others. It could be that you know, it destroys initiation, innovation. People are no longer creative. You know, lack of innovation. There's increased absenteeism. There's, you know, stress and depression. And let's look at what actually happens. And I'm sorry about that. The slide jumping over and, you know, back and forth. Let's look at initiations. People now are afraid to make mistakes. People are no longer innovative because they are being queried, they are being judged, and so on. They're no longer creative because when they try and bring in creativity, there's always a harsh judgment in terms of how they're addressing issues, or they're bringing up with ideas, or the ideas themselves. There's increased absenteeism, and this happens particularly where the conflict is now at an elevated stage. And absenteeism could be because of people are now constantly ill. And I'll address it when it comes to health problems. And there are, you know, suddenly somebody gives you a 2-hour notice to say, I'm not coming to work on this day or on that same day. And unfortunately, it also has a consequence in terms of your resources that you have. And people are, you know, abusing their sick leaves. And it's as a result of unresolved conflicts. you get a lot of people being booked off for stress and depression, and we know in some instances, especially Pila, when they are, at that point they can, they even get leaves for about 6 weeks, and you can imagine what happens in that period when your employees are not there for longer periods, and unfortunately, it results in, in some instances, especially for private companies, having to use resources elsewhere and compromising where you're drawing your resources from. And you look at also presentism. I mean, we spoke about where the employees are present, but they're not really working. They could be busy on their private issues because they lack morale. Their morale is low, or sometimes there isn't any morale at all. There's no motivation for them to work. They don't even look forward to coming to work. And you'll see that when they also have a high rate of absenteeism, lateness, late arrivals, dodging during office hours, knocking off early. Those are all some of the consequences of unresolved conflict. Because if you can investigate, you'll find that, late arrival, constant absenteeism, abuse of leave days. People are no longer contributing in meetings, in brainstorming sessions. If you actually look at that, you'd find that all these that I've just mentioned are just the symptoms. The sources thereof is because of unresolved conflicts. So it's very much important when we deal with this issues to look at the main sources. And, I always say, for an example, you'd find that, unresolved, they result also in disciplinary hearings, misconducts. And so some of them, it's just personal issues that were never resolved, and unfortunately, they escalated into misconduct hearings and, like we said, arbitrations, litigations. And unfortunately, because they're not unresolved, or they're not resolved, they end up in a situation whereby somebody has to be right, somebody has to be wrong. And that being the case, the conflict has not been really resolved. It was a question of, I was right, I was wrong, you were wrong. You give somebody written warnings, but those never actually resolved because we were dealing with superficial issues instead of really getting into the basics, the basics of what actually caused the conflict. And that's the end of my first part of presentation. The second part and the third part and so on, we'll be looking at various aspects of conflicts. Now that we understand what conflict is, we understand what are the sources of conflict and what are the consequences of conflict as well. Now we're going to look at what are the benefits of resolving these conflicts. Also, we're going to learn about the techniques, the strategies of conflict minimization, and how we can resolve these conflicts. We're going to give you the tools thereof. You're going to learn more about diversity issues. How do we effectively deal with diversity issues in order to minimize and avoid conflicts, or even at some point resolve conflicts? We're going to look at how then do we prepare ourselves for these negotiation sessions. There are certain, from preparation, your bargaining tools, your information exchange. How do you deal with deadlocks? How are you going to close negotiations so that if there's a need to reopen, you can always reopen, and so on. We're going to look at how do you interpret non-verbal communication. We'll remember that 93% of our communication is actually non-verbal. Only 7% is the words that you speak. So it's very much important to understand and interpret non-verbal communication. We're also going to look at how do you decode hidden meanings in words. Like, for example, when somebody says however or but, what do they actually mean at the end of the day? When somebody says by the way, What do they mean? When somebody says, I don't mean to be personal, but what do they mean? When somebody says, let's suppose, what do they actually mean in those words? So we'll be decoding those hidden meanings in those people. And also we'll be looking at what are some of the dirty and manipulative tactics that people use against others when they're in negotiations or when they try and resolve conflicts. And usually they use these tactics in order for them to, win, and so that the other party loses. So we're going to say or come up with or show you how you can achieve a mutually beneficial agreement where both parties live as win-win parties, and also how we can avoid other people losing at all times or making other people to lose, and so on. And also we'll be addressing issues of how do you achieve those situations where you all want to win, basically. And finally, we'll also look at how then different parties deal with conflict. And that is all. Please don't forget to click on subscribe so that you don't miss on our subsequent parts, which are part 2, part 3, part 4, and so on. Thank you so much.